Can Minsc, beloved Ranger, hold its own at a CEDH table? This Protean Hulk deck uses a lot of pieces to assemble its win, so let's see how it does tonight. First, we have our Mox Pro patron John piloting Aragorn the Uniter. This is a mid-range deck that seeks to gain value off of its commander with every spell it casts. It then wins the game with Underworld Breach Lines or Food Chain Loops. Next, we have our Mox Pro patron Matt piloting Minsc, beloved Ranger. This is a stacks list that seeks to lock down the board and pressure with combat. It then uses its commander to win the game with Protean Hulk lines. After that, we have Matt Sperling piloting Pantlaza, Sun Favored. This deck seeks to slow down the board using stacks. It then uses its commander to discover additional cards and win with blink effects and food chain lines. Finally, we have Ashani piloting Talion, the Kindly Lord. This is a control list seeking to control a board and get into the late game. It uses its commander to pressure life totals and gain card advantage. It then closes out the game with Thoracle or Labman. Without further ado, let's kick off this dry, drafty, dreamy dragon dropout. John won the Renegade Challenge and gets to start us off. John draws a card for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast a Mystic Remora. He passes. Matt draws and plays a Savannah. He casts a Serra Ascendant. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts a Chrome Mox. Remora triggers and John draws. Chrome Mox resolves, and with the imprint trigger still on the stack, Sperling casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Chrome Mox and Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and John draws again. In response, Ashani casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Force of Vigor. Remora triggers and John draws a card. Flusterstorm counters Force, and Ashani imprints Pact of Negation onto Chrome Mox. He casts a Lotus Petal, and John draws from Remora. Ashani ends his turn. Sperling draws and plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Finehorn Elves and ships the turn. During his upkeep, John lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Reflecting Pool. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Windswept Heath. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. John passes. Matt draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks John with Serra Ascendant. John takes it, and Matt gains 6 life. Matt passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays an Underground River. He gives the turn to Sperling. Sperling draws and plays a Spectator Seeding. He passes. At the end of Sperling's turn, John casts Enlightened Tutor. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, and John surveils one, leaving it on top. In response, Ashani casts Swan Song. Enlightened Tutor is countered, and John creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to John. John draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Channeler. Ashani takes 1, and John passes to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Minsc, beloved Ranger. Minsc enters, and Matt creates a Boo. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Serra Ascendant. Ashani takes it, and Matt gains 6 life. Matt passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn. He passes. Sperling draws, plays a Savannah, and ships the turn to John. John draws and casts Curiosity, targeting Dragon's Rage Channeler. Darcy triggers, and John surveils a Taiga into his graveyard. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Darcy. Ashani takes 1, Curiosity triggers, and John draws a card. In his second main phase, John plays a Wooded Foothills. John ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks John with Serra Ascendant. John blocks with his bird, and Matt gains 6 life. In his second main phase, Matt casts Sneak Attack. In response, John casts Blue Elemental Blast. Darcy triggers, and Matt surveils a Witness Protection into his graveyard. Sneak Attack is countered, and Matt passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a City of Brass. He passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Sperling casts Worldly Tutor, fetching up an Emil the Blessed onto the top of his library. Sperling draws and casts Emil the Blessed. He ends his turn. At the end of Sperling's turn, John cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. John draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Darcy. Ashani takes 1, Curiosity triggers, and John draws a card. In his second main phase, John plays a City of Brass. He casts Food Chain. Surprisingly, it resolves. John ships the turn to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Dryad Arbor. He activates Minsc's ability where X equals 2, targeting Serra Ascendant. He moves to combat and attacks John with Serra Ascendant. John takes 7, and Matt gains 7. In his second main phase, Matt casts Safri Eric's-Daughter. Matt ends his turn. Ashani draws and casts Mana Crypt. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 6 life. In response, Matt activates Safri Eric's-Daughter, sacrificing it, targeting Drannith Magistrate. All creatures die, Safri triggers, and Matt returns Drannith Magistrate to the battlefield. Disappointed, Ashani gives the turn to Sperling. Sperling draws and casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 1. In response, John taps the City of Brass to flash in at Archivist of Ogma. Then Sperling fetches up a Delighted Halfling onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and John gains a life and draws a card. Sperling passes. John draws and plays a Plateau. He moves to combat and attacks Sperling with Archivist of Ogma. Sperling takes it, and John ships the turn. Matt draws and pays 2 life to help cast a Birthing Pod. In response, John casts Spell Pierce, countering the spell. Matt passes. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an island. Ashani ends his turn. Sperling draws and casts a Null Rod. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Sperling gives the turn to John. Have you ever Googled yourself? I consider myself somewhat tech savvy, and even I was surprised by what I found. They had my address, phone number, political affiliation, and even the names of my relatives. Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live, for example. That is where Aura, today's sponsor, can help. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to. Aura does all of the work for you. But they do so much more. They do credit monitoring, bank monitoring, family monitoring, home and property, online security, dark web monitoring, and more. They also provide parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and even home title monitoring. It is really easy to set up, so you don't have to download several different apps. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online so you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. You can either let people continue to exploit and profit off of your private information, or you can go to aura.com/mtg to get protected. They have a 2-week free trial, so it costs you nothing to try out. Check out the link in the description. John draws, plays a Savannah, and passes. Matt draws and casts Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 1. It enters, and Matt fetches up a delighted halfling onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and John gains a life and draws a card. Matt ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Blood Chief Ascension. He passes. Sperling draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Thalia. Ashani takes it, and in his second main phase, Sperling casts Collector Roof. Sperling ends his turn. John draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Archivist. Ashani takes it, and John passes. Matt draws and recasts his commander, Minsc. It enters, and Matt creates a Boo. He moves to combat and attacks John with Boo. John takes 1 in order to avoid putting counters onto Blood Chief's Ascension. Matt passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Sperling draws and casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Karmic Guide, which is what he tutored for. Archivist triggers, and John gains a life and draws a card. Sperling moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Thalia and Collector Oof. Ashani takes it, and Sperling passes the turn. At the end of Sperling's turn, John cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield tapped. John draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Archivist. Ashani takes it, and John passes. Matt draws and casts Ethersworn Canonist. In response, Ashani casts Tainted Pact. Ashani exiles from the top of his library until he reveals a Windfall, putting it into his hand. Then Ethersworn resolves. Matt moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Rocco, Minsc, and Boo. Ashani takes it, and Matt ends his turn. Ashani draws and casts Grafdigger's Cage. Seeing that he is dead to attacks, he decides not to cast Windfall. Ashani passes. Sperling draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Delighted Halfling and Collector Roof. Ashani takes it, and Sperling passes to John. John draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts Wild Growth. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Archivist. Ashani takes it, and dies. John passes the turn. Matt draws and plays a Spectator Seating. He activates Minsc's first ability, making Boo a 4/4. He moves to combat and attacks John with Minsc, Boo, and Rocco. John takes 10, and Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Sperling casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Drannith Magistrate. In response, Matt casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, paying 1 extra for Thalia, targeting Swords. In response, Matt hard casts Force of Negation, targeting Deflecting Swat. Swat is countered and exiled, then Swords resolves. Drannith is exiled, and Matt gains a life. The turn moves to Sperling. Sperling draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He taps Sunbaked Canyon to help cast his commander, Pantlaza, Sunfavored. It enters, and Sperling discovers, revealing an Aven Mind Sensor, putting it into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Collector Roof. Matt takes it, and Sperling ships the turn to John. John draws and casts his commander, Aragorn the Uniter. John ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts Miss Moon Griffin. He activates Minsc's ability where X equals 0, targeting Miss Moon Griffin. Griffin dies, Matt exiles it, returning Sarah Ascendant from his graveyard to the battlefield. Matt passes. Sperling draws and casts Goblin Cratermaker. Sperling passes. At the end of Sperling's turn, John casts Hydroblast, targeting Minsc. Aragorn triggers, and John scries too. Minsc is destroyed, and the turn moves to John. John draws, takes no actions, and passes to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Mountain. He moves to combat and attacks John with Sarah Ascendant. John takes it, and Matt gains 6. In his second main phase, Matt recasts his commander, Minsc. It enters, and Matt creates a Boo, which dies to the legend roll. Matt ends his turn. At the end of Matt's turn, Sperling taps Sunbaked Canyon to help flash in an Aven Mind Sensor. Sperling draws and moves to combat. He attacks Matt with Aven Mind Sensor. Matt takes it, and Sperling gives the turn to John. John draws, again takes no actions, and passes. Matt draws and activates Minsc's ability where X equals 4, targeting Sarah Ascendant. He moves to combat and attacks John with Sarah Ascendant. In response, John casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Aragorn triggers, and John scries too. Then all of John's opponent's non-land permanents are bounced. In his second main phase, Matt recasts Sarah Ascendant. He recasts Ethersworn Canonist. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Sperling flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Sperling draws and plays a Brushland. He casts Goblin Crater Maker. He moves to combat and attacks John with Aven Mind Sensor. John takes it and Sperling ships the turn. John draws and casts Invasion of Ikoria where X equals 3. Aragorn triggers and gives itself +4/+4 until the end of turn. Then John searches the top 4, putting a Tinder Wall onto the battlefield, and then Matt gains control of Invasion. John passes. Matt draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He recasts his commander, Minsc. It enters and Matt creates a Boo. He activates Minsc's ability where X equals 2, targeting Sarah Ascendant. He moves to combat and attacks John with Sarah Ascendant. John takes it all, dies, and Matt gains 7 life. Matt passes the turn. At the end of Matt's turn, Sperling cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield tapped. Still in the end step, Sperling sacrifices Goblin Crater Maker, killing Ethersworn Canonist. The turn moves to Sperling. Sperling draws and casts Nature's Lore. He fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He taps Sunbaked Canyon to help cast his commander, Pantlaza Sun Favored. It enters and Sperling discovers, revealing a Temur Sabertooth, casting it. Sperling passes. At the end of Sperling's turn, Matt casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Mind Sensor is exiled and Sperling gains 2 life. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life again. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 4. It enters, and Matt fetches up an Academy Rector onto the battlefield. Matt activates Minsc's ability, where X equals 0, targeting Academy Rector. It dies, and Matt exiles it, fetching up a Pattern of Rebirth onto the battlefield attached to Boo. He activates Minsc's ability, where X equals 0, targeting Boo. Boo dies, Pattern of Rebirth triggers, and Matt fetches up a Protean Hulk onto the battlefield. Matt activates Minsc's ability where X equals 0, targeting Protean Hulk. Hulk dies, triggers, and Matt fetches up a Karmic Guide and an Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield. Karmic Guide triggers, and Matt returns Protean Hulk to the battlefield. He activates Minsc's ability, killing Protean Hulk, and fetching up a Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker onto the battlefield. He activates Kiki's ability, creating a copy of Karmic Guide. Karmic Guide enters, and Matt returns Protean Hulk to the battlefield. He activates Minsc's ability, killing Protean Hulk, fetching up a Village Bellringer onto the battlefield. Bellringer enters, and Matt untaps all of his creatures. Matt presents a loop of activating Kiki, creating a copy of Village Bellringer, and untapping his Kiki. He does this over and over until he creates 10,000 copies. He moves to combat, attacks Sperling with everything, and Matt wins the game. Well, I'd say that Minsc did really well in tonight's game. With the help of Sperling's stacks pieces, the table was kept under lockdown. Eventually, when the board was wiped, Matt found his window and closed out the game with some intricate loops. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Ethersworn Canonist. We thought about giving it to Protean Hulk, Minsc, and even Sarah Ascendant tonight. However, it was this card that kept everyone from progressing their game plans. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to check out this video of what happens when you Deflecting Swat appear into the Abyss.